Hello and welcome to the Liz Wheeler Show. The transgender boyfriend of Charlie Kirk's alleged assassin, Tyler Robinson, who remains behind bars, has been found after 5 months, seemingly on the run. He just vanished after his boyfriend shot Charlie Kirk. Lance Twiggs was finally spotted in person. And we have all the details about that for you coming up shortly. But first, newly declassified documents that lay in secret in our government for decades have now revealed shocking new aspects of one of the most infamous incidents in modern American history. Journalist James Rosen exclusively reports that former U.S. President Richard Nixon, who served between 1969 and 1974, at which time Nixon resigned, Nixon believed and had proof that he was taken out by the deep state. Yes, the very same deep state that exists today in government, in the bowels of Washington, D.C. Now, you and I have seen the deep state at work against the Trump administration right from the very beginning, since the moment Donald Trump took office, probably even before he was sworn into office in 2016 under Barack Obama. Most notably, of course, during the Russiagate scandal, when the intel communities of our federal government manufactured intelligence reports to use as a predicate to spy on the Trump administration. Now, many people at the time told us the deep state isn't real. It's a figment of Republican imaginations. Others told us that the deep state was only staging a resistance against Trump, as if that was justified. But what if the deep state is not new at all? What if the deep state has been operating in the shadows for decades, shaping the way our government operates without us knowing? What if the deep state is so powerful that they unseated a duly elected U.S. president and got away with it, and it wasn't even known until now? Today's episode is sponsored by All Family Pharmacy. If you've been waiting for the right time to stock up, well, this is it. Right now, All Family Pharmacy is running a President's Day sale with 47% off some of the most highly requested medications in America: ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, mebendazole, NAD, and many others. This is exactly why I like All Family Pharmacy. They're built for people who want our options, people who want to be prepared, people who don't want to be told, sorry, you're going to have to wait. You don't have to sit in a waiting room here. You don't have to argue with your doctor. You don't have to jump through hoops. You simply go online, you fill out a quick medical form, a licensed doctor reviews your request, writes the prescription, and your medication ships straight to your door. No coupon required. The President's Day sale runs through Tuesday, February 17th, and when it ends, the price goes right back up, so you better hurry. Don't wait. Go to allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz and grab the 47% off while it's still available. That's allfamilypharmacy.com/Liz, and you don't need a promo code. 47% off President's Day sale while it's still available. All right. The man who exposed these hidden classified documents that lay in our government in secret for decades is none other than the chief Washington correspondent for Newsmax, investigative journalist James Rosen. He's also the author of a new book called Scalia, Supreme Court Years 1986 to 2001. Highly recommend that. James, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Okay, James, I want you to walk me through this because we conservatives have been gaslit like crazy for the past decade about the deep state. We were told the deep state doesn't exist, this is a figment of your imagination, or that these are righteous individuals trying to unseat a threat in Donald Trump, which of course is false and offensive. But you have uncovered these 7 pages of very recently declassified documents that really change the way that we understand a very pivotal part of American history. Tell us about how this came to be and what you found.
So great to be with you, Liz, and thank you for your very kind words. This is an outgrowth of work I've been doing really for 30 years. I published a book in 2008 called The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate, which was a biography of President Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, who had been his law partner and campaign manager, and who really was the top law enforcement official at a very scary time in American history, the time of the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground and domestic bombings and so forth. And part of the story that I uncovered at that time was something called the Moorer-Radford Affair. What is the Moorer-Radford Affair? Now, I'm not the first to report on that. It gained some brief attention when Nixon was still in office, but it was quickly overshadowed by larger bombshell revelations from the Watergate scandal itself. Basically, the White House formed a special investigative unit in 1971 to plug news leaks such as the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. And that group was called the Plumbers informally because they plugged news leaks. It was the Plumbers who broke into Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. It was the Plumbers who broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist in Los Angeles, Ellsberg being the leaker of the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. But there was one other project on which the Plumbers worked and which was absolutely vital to national security. And that was that in the closing days of 1971, war broke out between two countries, India and Pakistan. The U.S. publicly professed its neutrality. But privately, behind the scenes, Nixon was favoring Pakistan because the Pakistani government was quietly helping Nixon make the arrangements for his historic trip to China, which came in February 1972. But in the closing days of 1971, a famous investigative reporter at the time named Jack Anderson published a couple of columns in December 1971 where he was quoting from Defense Department and White House memoranda, but even more shockingly, minutes taken at the NSC meetings of only 11 days prior, where Henry Kissinger, who was running the White House National Security Council, was telling his aides, "I'm catching hell every half hour from the president. He does not believe that we're doing enough to tilt toward Pakistan. He believes his wishes are not being fulfilled." Now, when Jack Anderson publishes those minutes from the NSC 11 days later, that is one of the most shocking developments of that era, because the Pentagon Papers have been focused on the Kennedy and Johnson administrations in the past. Here was leaks at a very high level of the national security establishment taking place in almost real time in 1971. So the Plumbers were assigned to find out who was leaking that material to Jack Anderson, who won the Pulitzer Prize for those columns. They very swiftly zeroed in on a young man who was 28 at the time, who is still alive today. He's now 82.
You're kidding.
Named Yeoman Charles Radford. And he was a young guy who had been in the Navy. He was still in the Navy. He was a trained stenographer and courier and body man. And he was selected to work in this office that was located at the Executive Office Building, part of the White House complex. That was a liaison office between, that's Charles Radford, between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council. And there was a pair of admirals who ran that office. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon years saw a problem growing and then become acute under Nixon and Kissinger, which was the systematic exclusion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's top military uniformed commanders, from policymaking. Nixon and Kissinger were concentrating the making of foreign and national security policy in the NSC, and the Joint Chiefs didn't like it. They used this young man, this stenographer, this courier and body man, Yeoman Charles Radford, whom you see there, and asked him to develop intelligence on Kissinger's NSC. And in short, what this young man later admitted to doing was he took a copy of every document that came across his vision. What he couldn't copy, he memorized. He dove through wastebaskets and burn bags. He literally rifled the briefcases of Henry Kissinger while he slept on overnight flights, and Kissinger's deputy, Alexander Haig. And in all, it's estimated that this yeoman stole 5,000 classified documents from the National Security Council over a year's time, 1970 to 71, in wartime, and delivered those documents to the Joint Chiefs of Staff through the admirals. And in the year 2000, let me go back. In 1974, the story was broken by a pair of reporters who were not Woodward and Bernstein. And the Senate Armed Services Committee held some brief hearings into this. But everybody involved. I'm sorry?
They held hearings into Radford?
Yes, on the Moorer-Radford affair. Once the newspapers broke this, that the Pentagon had been spying on Henry Kissinger this was broken in 1974. So the Senate Armed Services Committee had to do something. They held classified closed-door hearings. But everybody involved had good reason to want to let the matter drop. And ultimately, nothing was done. In the year 2000, the National Archives released the Nixon tapes for the month of December 1971. And there was one lonely researcher who showed up to listen to those tapes, and that was me, because I knew which date we were looking for. On the evening of December 21, 1971, after the plumbers had put this yeoman under a polygraph machine and he broke down crying, he refused to admit that he gave the documents to Jack Anderson, whom he admitted knowing, who was a fellow Mormon. But he did admit under intense pressure and polygraphing that he had given these 5,000 documents to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now the plumbers knew this was much bigger than news leaks. The lead Pentagon investigator said this is a 7 Days in May, which was a Cold War era movie and novel that was about the military unsuccessfully plotting to overthrow the President of the United States for pursuing peace deals with the Soviets. And of course, Nixon was pursuing rapprochement with the Soviet Union and China, and he had cut defense spending considerably in his first term. The tape of the December 21, 1971 meeting is the most important in all the Nixon tapes before Watergate. And as I say, it was released in 2000, and I was the first pair of ears outside the government to hear it. And essentially, you have only the heavy hitters: President Nixon, H.R. Haldeman, who was the chief of staff and the architect of modern White House operations, John Ehrlichman, who was the chief domestic policy aide to President Nixon and who ran the plumbers, and Attorney General John Mitchell, who, as I say, had been Nixon's law partner and campaign manager and was the closest thing that Nixon had to a friend in the government. Heavy hitters only. All three of those men later served prison sentences for Watergate. Henry Kissinger, whose NSC was the one victimized here, was purposefully excluded from the meeting because the president and his men considered that Kissinger himself was a profligate leaker to the Washington Post and elsewhere. And Ehrlichman had to tell the President of the United States, our investigative team, the plumbers, have essentially discovered that this enlisted man, this yeoman, who was attached to Kissinger and Haig at the NSC, has been stealing documents for 13 months in wartime. And as Ehrlichman explained it to the President, this guy has total recall. He can remember the exact sequence in which he Xeroxed things when he moved from room to room. He's like a machine. And Nixon, of course, was flabbergasted because no commander-in-chief had ever faced such a brazen and illegal challenge to his authority from the nation's top uniformed military commanders. And he declared, this is a federal offense of the highest order. It fell to Attorney General Mitchell to remind the president obliquely of all the secret operations that the president and Henry Kissinger had going on around the world. In Cambodia, they had been submitting phony ledgers to the United States Congress to protect the secrecy of those operations. In essence, Nixon and Kissinger were sort of like car thieves who awakened one morning to find that one of the cars they stole had in turn been stolen from them. You going to call the cops? So Attorney General Mitchell basically says, I'm going to go see Tom Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I'm going to tell him this ball game's over with. We're going to dissolve this liaison office. We're going to transfer these admirals out to some remote posts. We're going to transfer the yeoman out to a remote post. We're going to wiretap him for 6 months and his friends. And we're going to install a security officer in the National Security Council. Can you imagine how quaint the times were that the need was realized for there to be some sort of security apparatus over the documents of the NSC? Everything Mitchell proposed, Nixon agreed to. And I wrote an article about that tape and the next 10 days worth of tapes that showed how Nixon navigated this unprecedented constitutional crisis. And I wrote an article in 2002 for the Atlantic Monthly called Nixon and the Chiefs. And the main revelation was that rather than prosecute the chairman and the yeoman, they essentially agreed to cover it up and hush it up and bury it. Why?
Yeah,
For
why?
one thing, there was the risk of the exposure of all the secret operations that the Nixon administration had going. But more than that, as Nixon said on the tapes, this was a period when the armed forces, the uniform of the armed forces, was under widespread cultural assault, Liz. Returning veterans from Vietnam were being jeered on the streets as baby killers. Nixon, and he was very explicit on the tapes in saying this, did not want to contribute to the vilification of the armed forces in a time where they were already under widespread cultural assault. Now comes Watergate. Haldeman and Ehrlichman have to quit, and they go to the grand jury to face their fate. Of all people, he appoints Alexander Haig, Kissinger's deputy, to now run the White House as chief of staff. They had earlier concluded in that nighttime meeting that Haig was probably complicit in this and allowed tacitly the yeoman to do this. So he wasn't the greatest choice to run Nixon's White House in the last year and a half or so. And Nixon says to Haig at one point in a tape in 1973, I could have screwed Admiral Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and been a big hero on that. And you know why? You know why I didn't do it, because I thought more of the services. The Senate Watergate Committee, the top Republican was Howard Baker of Tennessee. He comes to Nixon. He's learned about the Moore Radford affair. None of it's been disclosed yet. It's 1973.
How did he learn about it?
Through the Senate Watergate Committee's their interviews with the Pentagon investigator who called it 7 days in May.
Okay.
And he says, Mr. President, the plumbers didn't just break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in the Watergate. They handled legit national security work. Let us tell the story of how the Joint Chiefs spied on you, and this could save your presidency.
Yeah.
And again, to his eternal credit, Nixon told Senator Baker no, because he did not want to contribute to the vilification of the armed forces. I published that article in 2002. In 2008, I published my book about Watergate, and the chapter devoted to this was based on something that Attorney General Mitchell said to President Nixon in that historic nighttime meeting. When he called it a federal offense of the highest order, Mitchell said back to the president, I agree with you, Mr. President. It's with the yeoman coming in here and giving these documents to the Joint Chiefs, it's just as if they were coming in here and robbing your desk. And the title of that chapter in my book from 2008, The Strong Man, was called Robbing the President's Desk.
I'm literally getting the chills listening to this. It's
You're kind to say so.
You can't make this up. I mean, it's nuts.
So I have never stopped studying the Moore Radford scandal and trying to obtain new materials. Nixon resigns. He is pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford, for all crimes he committed or may have committed while in office. That's 1974. The Watergate Special Prosecution Force, the special counsel of that day, was still in existence, and they still had some cleanup work to do. They had convicted Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell, but they still had other prosecutions running, and they were demanding access to ex-President Nixon for his testimony. And there was a big, long tussle between the Watergate special prosecutors and Nixon's lawyers. Ultimately, it was agreed that 8 special prosecutors, 2 members of a grand jury impaneled back here in Washington, and a stenographer would fly out to San Clemente, and they would interview and under oath, they would interrogate ex-President Nixon on 5 agreed-upon subjects, which included among them like the 18-and-a-half-minute gap that was found on one of the Watergate tapes, etc. That testimony by ex-President Nixon was the first time any president had ever appeared before a grand jury. It marked the only time that Mr. Nixon ever testified in depth about Watergate under oath. The testimony consumed 11 hours over 2 days' time in June 1975. At a certain point towards the close of the second and final day, one of the younger Watergate prosecutors starts to ask questions of the ex-president about what he calls the Radford Project. And he wants to know about the wiretapping that was done in that project. Nixon cuts him off. And he says, this was the most sensitive project of my presidency. And what ensued in the grand jury room out in San Clemente with the prosecutors, the 2 members of the grand jury, and a stenographer, and Nixon and his lawyers, the whole 11 hours of testimony took up 297 pages of transcript. The Watergate prosecutors knew right away that they were hearing things that was not meant for the consumption even of the rest of the grand jury back in Washington. When they get back to Washington, they take the 297 pages, and this has never been revealed before. This was revealed in my New York Times article. They take the transcript to the White House counsel's office under President Ford. And there in the counsel's office, besides the White House counsel, Phil Buchan, is a man named Brent Scowcroft, who is the lieutenant general who was deputy White House national security advisor. And they look at the transcript together. And Scowcroft takes out a red stamp that says classified. And there are 7 pages of this examination where Nixon had warned the prosecutors. He says, I would urge the special prosecutor, don't open that can of worms. But the next 7 pages, Scowcroft agrees. And he stamps each page classified 7 times. He hands it to the prosecutors. They take those 7 pages, they stick them in an envelope, they seal the envelope, they staple to the front of it an order from the Chief Judge of Washington dated the day before sealing these contents. He hands it to Scowcroft. Scowcroft takes that sealed envelope, sticks it in another sealed envelope labeled White House, seals it, and writes in his own hand, do not touch, not do not open, do not touch. Sealed in the presence of the White House counsel by Brent Scowcroft, July 1, 1975. It's interesting that the injunction extended beyond opening it to don't even touch it. There it stayed. And not until the year 2011 did the National Archives release that transcript. I
The
reported on it for
297-page transcript, right? Not the 7 pages?
Well, yes, 290 of the 297 pages.
Oh.
I reported on it for Fox News. Josh Gerstein of Politico reported on it. It was an amazing transcript, but you're a Daily Deadline reporter. You're looking at a 300-page transcript. You're going to pick a few quotes, make a story, and keep going. 7 pages, those 7 pages that General Scowcroft had stamped classified, remain classified even in 2011. And to remind you, 2011 is 36 years after the grand jury examination and 17 years after Nixon's death. Recently, I got my hands on those 7 pages. And that's what I published in the New York Times and on this past Sunday. And the revelations of those 7 pages are significant. They talk about, and through the course of researching this, I was able to bring still more that's been unpublished to the record of this era in the New York Times, such as some of the excerpts from the transcriptions, the FBI transcriptions of Yeoman Radford's phone conversations. It turns out 2 other people were wiretapped as part of the Radford Project. One a State Department official, one a Defense Department official. That had never been known before, and I identified them by name in this article. I would say the chief revelation of the 7 pages in which Nixon is describing how in the India-Pakistan war, if China sided with Pakistan and got jumped by the Russians, then we would side with the Chinese and so on. It was global power politics inside dope that none of the listeners in that room, including the prosecutors, had ever heard in their lives. That's why they took the transcript to Scowcroft. The chief revelation, though, I think, is that Nixon says at one point, I met the yeoman on a plane, casually. He was a brilliant young man. He spoke several languages. Now, it had never been known that Nixon met Yeoman Radford. And to Americans of a certain age, it brings to mind the infamous photograph of the Soviet spy, Alger Hiss, who was a high-ranking State Department official in the New Deal era, shaking the hand of President Truman in San Francisco in 1945. If you want to know how high up the chain of command the mole got, the answer was, in his case, and in this case, the Moore Radford affair, the very top. And so all of this is of a piece with still other institutional spying on President Nixon, who I call the most spied on president of modern times. My work using the Freedom of Information Act for that book, The Strong Man, showed that I got 200, 300 pages of FBI files for John and Martha Mitchell, the Attorney General and his wife. They were the first cabinet couple to receive round-the-clock protection from the FBI because Mrs. Mitchell was a famous figure in her own right, and they were receiving death threats. And I discovered in 1992, when I got my hands on those FBI files, that every word the Mitchells said in the company of these agents, driving them places, fixing their burglar alarm in the Watergate East apartment complex where they lived, every word they said was being typed up and sent up the chain of command to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. And how do we know that? Because Hoover would literally write on these documents in his own hand and sign his initials with comments on what the Mitchells were saying. And so that is the FBI spying on the boss of the Department of Justice, their boss, Attorney General John Mitchell, Nixon's closest friend. As well, CIA was concerned about the existence of the plumbers. They did not want, as the professionals in the spy game, some amateur bunch of people they'd never heard of conducting break-ins around the country. And it was clear to CIA that the plumbers had to be infiltrated, if not neutralized altogether. And so we now know from a variety of official sources, and this is beyond dispute at this point, this is irrefutably demonstrated by the archival evidence, that CIA was detailing its personnel to various units in the orbit of President Nixon, from the Watergate burglary team itself, which had an agent on the team who was reporting back to CIA. And when the Watergate special prosecutors went to Langley and said, we demand the personnel file of that individual, Langley told the Watergate special prosecutors to stuff it, that they would fight any subpoena to the death because it would breach the trust of, quote, an agent. So they had an agent on the Watergate, the plumbers, okay? And the agency admitted in 1975 that they had infiltrated with their personnel, quote, intimate components of the office of the president. And we now know that one of those offices of the president that CIA detailed its personnel to was the Technical Services Division of the United States Secret Service, which happened to be the unit that was responsible for the maintenance and operation of President Nixon's taping system. So, The more Radford, the military spying, which was the most organized perhaps of all of it, all of this is of a piece. And all of it adds up to a beast that is the deep state. And as I said in the New York Times article, 50 years ago in a small Coast Guard station in San Clemente, President Nixon, ex-President Nixon, was able to prove to the satisfaction of the grand jury and the Watergate special prosecutors that not only did such a beast as the deep state exist, but that he himself, the president, guilty as he was in the Watergate scandal, had been its victim. So I've been at this for a very long time, Liz.
I mean, we're all history buffs here. I am absolutely mesmerized by this. It's wild to me that this many decades after, I don't know, I think of Watergate as like established history, right? I don't think of it as something that still requires investigation, I guess. And that's why you're good at this and why I listen to you. It's wild to me that there are still documents that illustrate a huge part of this that you just now got your hands on. I mean, I said this at the beginning. We've been gaslit for years. Anytime we mention the deep state or swamp creatures or the administrative state or the permanent bureaucracy, these sort of subversives inside government that think that they have a right to dictate policy. And when I was reading your New York Times piece, and by the way, I can't tell you the last time that I read probably, what was your essay, 10,000 words? I can't tell you the last time I read 10,000 words in the New York Times. So huge credit to you. All I could think of is it's the same tug of war. These military commanders think, and they're unelected, remember, think they have a right to dictate policy that impacts not just our country in a vague sense, but us, like whether we go to war and what our foreign relations are with different countries. And they actually had the audacity to put a spy in the inner circle of the president because they felt they were entitled to this privilege of creating policy. Like, this sounds wilder than a James Bond film.
So during the Senate Armed Services hearings of 1974, Yeoman Radford testified that he would be seated outside the door of the admiral who supervised him, or outside the door of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and other top military brass who were not necessarily in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but very high up in the Pentagon, admirals and generals, would pass his desk and say to him things like, "Good job, Radford." And he knew that they knew, and they knew that he knew that they knew. Everyone knew what he had done a good job doing. And in fact, one of these officers stops by Radford's desk and says to him, "You have no idea how useful and important it is for the admiral to go into a meeting at the White House and to know in advance what's going to be said." That's really the motivation for the spying. Now, you said something in the introductory portion of the segment, with which some small quibble might be taken, and that is, you said this is the same deep state, and we have to conclude that it's not, simply due to generational attrition. This is not the same New York Mets, and cannot be, that won the 1969 World Series. But the New York Mets of today, it's extraordinary to me, and I've said this, the New York Mets and the State Department are like the same kind of institution. No matter who the new players are, successive generations of new players, they seem to exhibit the same features. At the State Department, it's hostility to conservative foreign policy. In the New York Mets, it's great pitching and weak hitting. And it doesn't matter how much you spend on free agents or generational attrition. It's just somehow this institution retains the same character. So I would say that about the deep state, but we can't call it exactly the same one.
Point taken, because it's not the same individuals, but I would say the connective tissue is the entitlement and the ideology, that the American people's voices don't matter and that these people are entitled to run the government even though they're not elected. You made a comment earlier that it is fascinating to me. You said, to Nixon's eternal credit, he did not go after Radford because of his high esteem for the military. In hindsight, watching what the deep state has become or was allowed to become because maybe it wasn't put down at the time, do you think that was the right decision by Nixon?
So when Kissinger is informed of what's been going on, he explodes and he says he won't fire more, he won't fire the admirals, and he said, "I assure you, all of this tolerance is going to lead to very serious consequences for this administration." And he was exactly right. And there was no decision Nixon took that was probably more damaging than his installation of Alexander Haig as his final chief of staff. Perhaps Nixon took a fatalist view of his presidency after Haldeman and Ehrlichman were fed to the grand jury. I mean, among the things that Haig did in that time period when he was chief of staff was withhold deliberately from President Nixon the 3 days of advance knowledge that he enjoyed, that an obscure aide named Alexander Butterfield was about to testify on television to the Senate Watergate Committee that Nixon taped all of his conversations. Armed with that information 72 hours in advance, which they were, Nixon, from his hospital bed at Walter Reed at that time, could have, where he was conscious and making decisions, could have decided to burn the tapes or could have sued to enjoin Mr. Butterfield from testifying. But Haig let that go forward, for example. But I know that that some Nixon administration veterans, when they saw the first impeachment trial of President Trump, said to me, gosh, some of us are looking at this and saying we should have fought. Now, the whole landscape of American politics, and particularly the media ecosystem, is very different from Nixon's time. Our means of communication and the existence of your show right now attest to this. I closed this article in the New York Times with comparisons between and contrasts between Presidents Nixon and Trump. Mr. Trump, as early as 1982, was expressing great admiration for Richard Nixon publicly, which was very uncommon at that time.
Yeah.
Both have certain similarities in that they both achieved success early in life. Both of them, at the same time, at once craved and scorned the approval of the elites, and both of them came to resent the very establishment that they came to lead. The two signal differences that I see are, number one, since he returned to power in January of 2025, President Trump has demonstrated a ruthlessness toward the expungement of the perceived enemy within the government that President Nixon, despite similar inclinations, could never conjure, even when faced, as we've seen, with criminal insubordination. The other major difference is that at this stage of things, Mr. Trump appears on track to complete his second term.
Yep. And it's why, I mean, this is why so many of us voted for President Trump, because drain the swamp is not just a slogan. It needs to be done, or else history is going to repeat itself. Listen, I'm going to get your book from, did you say it was 2008 on Watergate? I'm going to read it all.
Yes.
You have a new book out. I want to show the cover of that on the screen because, you know, we love Scalia on this show too. We miss him. Imagine what his commentary would be at such a time as this. Tell us briefly about your book and where everyone can find your work these days.
Thank you, Liz. This is volume 2 of a 3-volume biography of Antonin Scalia. It began its life as a concise biography, but just from this segment, Liz, I think you know, as Mrs. Rosen can attest, that I don't do anything concisely. And so the first book was published 3 years ago. It was called Scalia: Rise to Greatness, and it charted the first 50 years of his life, and it ended with him sitting down on the Supreme Court. This book that's out this week, Scalia, Supreme Court Years, 1986 to 2001, covers the first half of Scalia's nearly 30 terms on the Supreme Court. One of my favorite chapters in this new book is called The Rabbit. It's about the pair of lunches I had with Antonin Scalia in the 90s and 2000s, where this is the country's foremost opponent of judicial activism, and who then overruled my lunch order of veal parmesan and said, give him the rabbit. And so I had to have the rabbit. And that was something. But, you know, there were 2 biographies of Scalia published in his lifetime. One of them he and his family cooperated with extensively, the other not at all. And both of them came out in the same place, which was openly hostile to Justice Scalia's personality, his philosophy, and his jurisprudential legacy. This is the first admiring biography of Scalia, or as I like to say, Liz, this is the first biography written by an author who has his head screwed on straight. And it's not just for lawyers. Scalia was funny as hell, as he was at those lunches with me, knocking back wine and making me eat off of his plate, driving me back to work in his car while he smoked cigarettes and honked at other people. This is a book where, yes, you will learn about why he's so important in the law, his philosophy of originalism, how he got, through his force of personality and his brilliant writing style, was able to change the way American law is written, debated, judged, and decided. It used to be, when he came along, a liberal concept called the living Constitution, the idea that the Constitution should be a living, expanding document that today's judges should be free to interpret as widely as they want, which is really a way of allowing latter-day judges to graft their current policy preferences onto an existing document or an existing law. He stood athwart all that, and he stood for originalism, which is to say the Constitution is neither living nor dead. It's an enduring legal text. And we don't care what the lawmaker's intent was. The intent is what they voted up or down on and a president signed into law. And he changed the way the law is drafted, argued, and decided. And by the time he died, no less a figure than Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, appointed by President Obama, former dean of the Harvard Law School, pronounced publicly, in effect, as a result of this Scalia revolution, that we are all originalists now. So this is a book that's not just for lawyers. It's funny as hell often, and it tells the story of a man who embodied the American dream, the son of an immigrant and the daughter of immigrants, who rose from very modest circumstances to the pinnacle of his profession through his hard work, his genius, his affability, his humor, and also his Catholic faith, and who changed our world. And if you want to understand modern America and how we got here, you have to understand Antonin Scalia. And this book, as I say, is for all people, and even for young people, for students as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like this series of books is not just for lawyers, but for any American who wants to understand history. I mean, this stuff, the whole James Rosen library, if you want to have an educated electorate, educated Americans, you guys know where to go. Go get his books, support his work. It's absolutely incredible. By the way, speaking of Scalia's Catholic faith, one of my favorite stories about him is his son, of course, is a Catholic priest. And he accidentally got in the confessional line of his son at one point. And when they both realized it, they both took off. Which I find to be a very amusing story, especially when he was a Supreme Court justice at the time, which I'm sure you know more details about that than I do.
And probably Justice Scalia felt that Father Paul should be confessing to him. But Father Paul Scalia, it bears noting, is the vicar of clergy for the Archdiocese of Arlington, Virginia, and not just because of his famous name, but because of his own extraordinary body of works, of good works, and the brilliance of his homilies. He is one of the most revered priests and best known priests in America today.
Yes, he is. James, I know I've kept you way over time, and I make zero apologies for it. I could keep you for another hour. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for narrating this history for us. It was really great. I enjoyed it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Liz.
Of course. Okay, guys, make sure you go get his books. Check out his New York Times article. I know we're not New York Times fans on this show, and I certainly am not a New York Times fan. I read the entire word-for-word article that James Rosen wrote on Sunday. Highly recommend it. It's very good. Okay, we have a very interesting, significant report that I want to discuss with you. That is what I spoke about at the very top of the show, which is the transgender identifying boyfriend of Charlie Kirk's alleged assassin. The alleged assassin, of course, is Tyler Robinson. The transgender identifying boyfriend of Tyler Robinson, whose name is Lance Twiggs, seemingly disappeared. He just vanished as soon as Tyler Robinson shot Charlie Kirk. No one saw him. Nobody. He was gone. He shared an apartment with Tyler Robinson. The apartment was widely surveilled. We even had insiders, friends of Lance Twiggs and Tyler Robinson, telling us what the inside of their relationship was like, what the inside of that apartment was like. We had comments from family members of Tyler Robinson and Lance Twiggs. And yet Lance Twiggs himself was just gone. And we ask, is he on the run? Is he in witness protection? Where is this guy? There was not a photograph snapped of him. Not a trace of him seemed to remain until now. The Daily Mail exclusively reports that Charlie Kirk's suspect's trans lover is revealed in a suburban southern hideout. This is what the Daily Mail reports. The transgender lover of Charlie Kirk's alleged killer has finally emerged from hiding 5 months after the political assassination that stunned the world. Lance Twiggs vanished overnight after his live-in boyfriend, Tyler Robinson, was unmasked as the gunman accused of shooting Kirk in the neck as he, Kirk, debated trans issues at Utah Valley University. Reclusive 22-year-old Twiggs, whom authorities, this is the Daily Mail, of course, refer to with male pronouns, because he's a male, has never been charged or implicated in the September 10th shooting. But his abrupt disappearance from their apartment in St. George, Utah, fueled fevered speculation over what, if anything, Twiggs knew in advance of Robinson's alleged plot to snuff out one of the nation's leading conservative voices. Now the Daily Mail can reveal how the pasty loner is quietly rebuilding his life hundreds of miles away after reconciling with his strict Mormon family and relocating with them to Texas. Sources say he spends his days gaming online and reading fantasy novels, occasionally venturing out to grab takeout or run errands for his parents, Tyler and Amy. Exclusive Daily Mail images show Twiggs carrying clothes, sneakers, and a stack of books into his new 4-bed digs in an unassuming suburban neighborhood. His androgynous, shoulder-length hair is paired with a baseball cap, a blouse and jacket, jeans, and a retro Taco Bell shirt, giving him a grungy, hipster look. You can, of course, see this picture of him on the screen in front of you. The Daily Mail continues by saying, when the Daily Mail caught up with Twiggs at a nearby gas station, he scowled at our reporter and then refused to answer questions about his links to 22-year-old Robinson, who could face death by firing squad. We, the Daily Mail writes, asked him if he had any inkling that his furry fetishist beau was planning to kill Turning Point USA founder Kirk, 31, or if he had any words of comfort for widowed Erica Kirk, 37 years old, and their 2 children. No, 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 Twiggs repeated nervously. I cannot answer any questions. He took a business card before hopping into his beaten-up Infiniti and driving away. For the very first time, his image has been revealed. Isn't it always at a gas station that people who are supposedly on the lam are spotted? Like, for goodness sakes, do you not have someone else who can go pump gas for your car? He looks quite similar to the photos that we've seen of him in the past. He looks challenged. He looks like he's suffering some kind of mental consternation, which we have pretty good indication from other reports may in fact be a significant mental illness. But don't you wonder which question he was asking, or he was answering when he said no, no, no? Was he saying no, he had no inkling of what Tyler Robinson had planned before Tyler Robinson murdered Charlie Kirk? Or was he saying he had no words of sympathy for Erica Kirk, the widow of Charlie Kirk? No, 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 Twiggs repeated nervously. I cannot answer any questions. See, this is what's strange to me. When someone is innocent of an accusation, when a false accusation has been levied against them, usually, and this is human nature, I would react like this, and I venture to say you would too, we would trip over ourselves to set the record straight. Of course I didn't know anything about it. It was the most horrendous thing I've ever experienced. I condemn it wholeheartedly. Had I had any idea, I would have immediately reported it to authorities because I'm against that sort of things. It's immoral and wrong, and he should be held to the fullest extent of justice under the law. That would be a normal response if, in fact, Lance Twiggs knew nothing about it. He may have known nothing about it. I don't know. The FBI and other authorities, I hope, have questioned him, and not just questioned him in a way that they took his word for it when he answered, but I hope the FBI and other law enforcement entities have investigated Lance Twiggs's involvement, whether he was aware in any way, shape, or form what Tyler Robinson was planning, what he was thinking, the plot to assassinate our friend, Charlie Kirk. No, 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 Twiggs repeated nervously. I cannot answer any questions. But now it seems he's simply living in Texas with his family. Doesn't seem like he's changed his lifestyle, gaming during the day, reading fantasy novels. A couple of months ago, we read a report from an insider, a friend of Lance Twiggs and Tyler Robinson, who had spent significant time in their apartment. This insider had revealed to an internet personality named Turkey Tom what the relationship was like between Lance Twiggs and Tyler Robinson, how Lance Twiggs was mentally unstable, how he would spiral into these very dark places in his mind. And this insider, this friend of Lance Twiggs, said, if I were a Christian, I would wonder if he was possessed. This insider described what the apartment looked like on the inside, that it was a nest of wires and scribbled demonic drawings and Temu trinkets, and that if anyone tried to tidy up or clean up the mold experiments that Twig engaged in, he would freak out. that drugs were used in that apartment, and that Tyler Robinson had seemingly been groomed into engaging in sexual activity with Lance Twiggs. Lance Twiggs was also the one who seemed to pull Tyler Robinson towards a leftist political ideology, because Lance Twiggs, of course, identified as transgender and had been taking off-market hormone replacement therapy drugs. We don't know what was in them or what dosage or what impact it had on Lance Twiggs, except that the insider, the friend of Lance Twiggs, who said that he played games and cards with the two of them in their apartment for years and years, described a darkness and a significant mental crisis that Lance Twiggs seemed to be constantly suffering from. Why wouldn't he deny if these associations don't exist? Listen, in the days and weeks leading up to Charlie Kirk's assassination, there were signals online. There were posts on X and on other social media networks. People who said things that seemed to signal that they had some kind of foreknowledge of what was about to happen. Posts that you wouldn't make if you didn't know something was about to happen. Now, these individuals and the groups in that area in Utah, the radical, militant transgender groups, all went dark immediately following the assassination of Charlie Kirk. We don't have answers. Maybe law enforcement does. Maybe the prosecutors do. Maybe the FBI does. But if they do, we don't yet know the conclusion of the investigation over whether Lance Twiggs and or Tyler Robinson had any association with those radical groups or the individuals who posted things that seemed to indicate foreknowledge of what Tyler Robinson did to Charlie Kirk. And Lance Twiggs just vanished. For 5 months, we saw neither hide nor hair of him until this week, when he's spotted in Texas, pumping gas in his car, refusing to answer questions, not issuing a denial of any foreknowledge of the assassination of Charlie Kirk in a way that any normal person would. I've said this before, and I'll repeat it. If I'm the FBI, this is what I'm investigating. I'm investigating Tyler Robinson's trans furry boyfriend and the friends and transgender activists that they associated with, the radical transgender groups, the whole network of those groups in the area, and who had foreknowledge of what Tyler Robinson was about to do. While the pictures from the Daily Mail, the photographs of Lance Twiggs are chilling, I, for one, am not convinced when I hear this nervous denial that doesn't even seem specific to the question about foreknowledge. No, I can't answer any questions. Well, why can't you answer any questions? That answer remains to be seen. All right, Jason says, I think Lance Twiggs was forced to move to Texas by witness protection. Why was he at a gas station then? That seems to be the place. If ever there's someone that's engaged in a scandal, whether it's a celebrity or a politician, they always end up being photographed by paparazzi or media reporters at the gas station. If you're in witness protection, I don't think that you go to the gas station. I speculated the same thing after Charlie Kirk's assassination. Is he in witness protection? Did he actually have the final mental breakdown? And was he institutionalized? Where is he? Was he on the lam? Is he on the run? How do you just disappear like this when the eyes of the entire nation are upon you? Someone knows where he is. All right. Jason speculates, this is an allegation that says Lance Twiggs knew Tyler Robinson was going to kill Charlie Kirk. He knows a lot more. That, of course, is Jason's speculation. It's also a question I share with Jason. I think a lot of us share, because the indications for further investigation into whether Lance Twiggs knew that Tyler Robinson was going to kill Charlie Kirk are certainly there. And this article from the Daily Mail does not negate any of those questions. If anything, it increases the urgency because, as I said, if you were accused of foreknowledge of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, how would you react? What would you say? Would you go silent, vanish on the lam for 5 months without any denial, any statement, any public condemnation and establishment of your innocence? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't, because you're normal. And Lance Twiggs is not. All right, make sure, as I said earlier, I highly recommend James Rosen's work. The man is fascinating, one of the great historians of our time. Highly recommend you read his New York Times article about Richard Nixon, who believed he was taken down by the deep state, and he had evidence of that. A spy was placed by the upper echelons of the military, the leadership of the United States Armed Forces, to spy on the National Security Council. Nixon's team, who was making policy that excluded military leadership, and they were mad about it because they felt entitled to be a part of governing our country. The deep state is going to deep state, and it is absolutely chilling to see how long they have done it, that they successfully took out a sitting U.S. president, and that it remained essentially a secret that they did so until James Rosen reported on those 7 pages of classified documents that revealed the truth. Highly recommend that you go read that article and, of course, buy Rosen's books on Scalia. Thank you for watching today. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.